Hey guys, Paul here with Diamond State. Welcome back for another fly tying video. Today we're going to tie my Disco Deceiver. Hope you guys enjoy. Let's talk about the fly. Not a whole lot of materials in it, but at the same time a few. Tail, standard saddle hackles. Body, we've got some bucktail, and then our accent flash is going to be some ice wing fiber. Kind of for our filler, going to use something new to the shop here. We've got in some Textreme long hair, really similar to polar chenille. Comes in a bunch of cool colors. And then for our head on this one, we're going to finish off with a EP Minnow head brush. You can really throw whatever head you want on these things. It's going to affect the action a little bit and the depth of it. So like in our shallower water, I fish these brush heads more than anything. Gives me more of a little suspending action versus coming over here. We've got like a resin head. That's going to be more for kind of our 7,000 CFS range and up to like 12. I like fishing those unweighted bugs with those resin heads. They cut through the surface film nicely, but don't get too deep too quick. And then when we've got big water, that's when I move into like my fish skulls. It's going to give the fly a little bit of a jigging action, but at the same time it's still going to have that S swim, and kind of when you pause that fish skull one, it's going to kind of dip off to the side and flutter its way down a little bit. The other two on the pause, they're more of just a straight up stall and swim a little bit and turn off to one side, which I really like that action. It seems to trigger a lot of bites when you have follows and you kind of kill that fly right in their face. Other than that, hooks, we're using some Gamakatsu B10S's. Gonna use a 1 and a 1/0 on this one. Articulation on these ones, these are some older ones that I did that I used to tie them with shanks in them just to get a really swimmy action out of them. Now I just tie them with the bead and the wire just to save myself some time. Doesn't really affect it that much. Seems like it catches fish just the same. But yeah, it's super fishy fly. I caught a bunch of species for me over the years. And yeah, we'll get into tying it. So to get started here, we'll pop this guy out of the vise and get our size 1 B10S set in there. For thread on this one, I'm just using UTC 140. This is brown. Color doesn't really matter all that much on the thread because it just kind of blends in with the bug. So for our tails, we're going to take our Nature Spirit Select saddles, and I like to do my tails with my feathers splayed out like that on the paws. It just gives them a little more action, makes them pop out like that. And then when I tie them in, I just go right on top of my hook shank, tie them right in, and I'll tie those stems down a little bit. That out of there. Now we'll take a very sparse section of bucktail. As you can see, I've kind of worked this one for all it's worth, except for about the tip. Doesn't have a whole lot of action in the tip of it, so we're going to focus on this more hollow hair through most of the bug. The only section of bucktail that I like to use this tip hair on this fly is this very first tie-in. So we'll take a section from right about here, and we use very sparse clumps of bucktail. So maybe like, I don't know, a quarter of a pencil is how it feels in my hand. And just kind of thin out all the under fur fibers out of it. And as you can see, it's not very much when I spread that all out. So for this first clump, I want my bucktail to come about halfway down my tail. So I'll measure, and then when I tie in my bucktail, I like to trim before I tie it in. Just helps me keep my flies nice and clean when I'm tying with this material. And now if I want to flare it a little bit, I can pull on it while I've got my thread under tension. And I'll flip over for my belly. We'll do the same kind of section of hair for the belly section as well, in about the same amount. Pretty dang sparse. And now I'll just measure off my olive and flip it back over, transfer hands, trim, and tie it in. Now I can kind of spread it around my hook point, tame it down, and tie it back a little bit. Now, for kind of the accent flash portion of the back of the fly here, we're going to go to our ice wing fiber. This is Minnow back for the color. And out of the water, this fly looks really flashy. Once it gets about 1.5 feet down, that flash mutes out some, and it kind of takes on the look of fish scales. So I'm going to fold that in half and trim it in half, and then I can apply a little taper to it. Now I'm going to fold it around my thread and pin that right to the top of my hook shank. Now I'll take my thumb and just spread it so it covers all of my olive bucktail and gives me a nice little 180 across the back. Tie it back to where I've got my bucktail tied in, and then I'll just give it a little quick comb out. And I'm going to trim it up just a touch here so it's just the same length as my bucktail, maybe a slight bit longer. And I'll just run my scissors down that while I've got some tension applied to it, and it'll trim right out. So now for our filler flash, we're going to go to the Textreme long hair or polar chenille or aqua veil, kind of whatever you want to use. It's just in there for some accent. And to keep it nice and light so we get a good swim out of our tail, I'm just going to wrap this forward in open spirals and just brush it back as I go. Separate those fibers a little bit and tie it off, two over it and two in front to lock it in. Then you can trim it out. And I always tie back over it just a little bit just to really secure everything. Now we're ready for another section of bucktail. So again, keeping it sparse, I'm going to move down to about the midpoint of that tail and take just a slightly heavier clump than I did before, maybe only like an additional 10 fibers or so, not much. Pick any of the really long stragglers out and take out the shorties as well. Now I'll measure again, and I want it to go right about 2/3 of the way down my previous bucktail stack. That's going to help give me a nice teardrop taper in the end. So I'll just clean my butts up just a little bit. I'll tie them right in on the top of my shank, and I can spread my bucktail slightly with my thumb to get a little more coverage. I'll flip it over. I'll do the same thing again with my yellow. Using about the same clump as I just did with my olive. Measure and trim. Flip it back over and tie in. Again, I can put my thumbnail to it, spread it out a little bit, and now I'll tie them back to the same point here so they taper back evenly. Okay. Now we'll go in with another section of that ice wing fiber, using pretty much the same size clumps all the way through the bug on the ice wing fiber. You don't have to go any thicker. And kind of my measurement for it now, I mean, I can get probably 14 flies out of a bag of that ice wing fiber if I'm doing one color pattern. Is kind of how I like to pace myself as far as kind of measuring my clumps go. So I'll pin that up to the top, then I'll spread it, secure it down, and then I'll brush it out. I like to just really inspect everything as I comb, make sure it's where I want it. If I have some thin spots, I could spread it out a little more. If I have some thick clumps, we can thin them out. And now we'll just taper that back again, just kind of trim it up. And the last step for our tail, we're just going to take a piece of Flashabou down each side here. So pin it on one side, fold it around and down, so it runs down that other side. And now we can whip finish our back hook. Or we can mess up the whip finish on the first one. Put the Flashabou back in here. All right. So there's our back half done. Pop that out, just stick it on our magnet there. And then we'll pop our one on in the vise. Lay down a little bit of a thread base here, just get it started. And now I'm gonna give my bobbin a pretty hefty spin clockwise. Just kind of cord my thread up. Now I'm going to run it back and forth up and down that shank just to make sure I've got kind of a rough base to tie my wire into. Now for our articulation wire, it's just nylon coated stainless steel wire. Tie it in, and we'll take our MFC teardrop bead with the fat side facing forward. Just keep everything going for that teardrop taper. And one thing I've noticed with these beads, you want to leave yourself a little bit bigger loop back there. If you go really tight, it'll suck all the way down to your fly and you won't get as good of action out of it. But leaving that little bit bigger loop, your action stays very nice. So we'll just run that back up the shank, double it back so we reinforce our connection here. And now we'll put a lot of pressure into these thread wraps. As you can see, I like to kind of brace my vise and hook so I can really reef on that thread. Yeah. So now we'll come back in with our filler flash. So on the back hook, we kept it open spirals. Front hook, we're gonna do touching wraps just to kind of increase our density, keep a little more water push up at the front, light and wispy in the back so it stays nice and free. Alright, so I'll separate my materials. Tie it off. So now we'll come in with a fairly hollow section of bucktail down here toward the base. We want this hair to flare a good amount on the front hook. Still just getting slightly thicker than my previous sections, not much. Now we're about, I don't know, maybe half of the number 2 pencil. And we're gonna take about the same measurement. We want this section of bucktail to go about 2/3 of the way back into our previous section of bucktail. Trim up our butts, make everything nice and clean. I used to do this as a reverse tie. Now I just do a regular tie-in on the front or on this section of bucktail. And I just go with some hollower hair. Makes it a little faster. And same thing for our yellow. Which on these deceivers, kind of as far as bucktails to pick, I'm not looking for the really good bucktails when I tie these flies. I like more of the kind of 2-inch long hair, because as you can see, I just end up trimming this out anyway. So I always feel bad when I have to tie a bunch of these and all I have is good bucktail sitting around my tying room, because then I just end up chopping it up. Which, a couple of those fibers came out as I was pulling on them, no big deal. If they were meant to be in there, they would have stayed. Alright, so now we'll come back in with another section of our ice wing fiber. Cut it in half again and kind of taper everything up. And we'll fold it back around our thread. Go in with my thumbnail and just spread it. And now I can comb through it. And we'll give it a nice little tapered trim. And we'll come back in with our flash one more time here. So on the resin heads and the fish skull heads, I put my last section of bucktail right here behind the eye. On these brush heads, obviously you need to leave a little bit of room for yourself. Your goal is to get about 4 wraps of that brush in there to give you enough bulk to have some water push. Otherwise, with the fish skull heads and the resin heads, like I said, I go right here behind the eye. So we're not gonna run as much of the flash as we would if we were doing a different head on it. But I'll stop right at about where I stop my articulation wire. I always kind of go to the same point of my hook, leave about 1/4 inch of space, and I just use that kind of as my measurement as I tie these. I know where to stop every time. So again, we're doing touching wraps just to kind of build some density in there. Tie that off. Just brush everything back, clean it up a little bit. Now for our last section of bucktail. I'm going to use this section right at the very bottom. I really want some flare out of this. And when I am working with that stuff lower on the tail, usually there's a bunch of really short fibers in it, so I'll cut thicker and kind of thin everything out a little bit extra, so I still end up with the amount that I want. Again, so now on this section we're gonna reverse tie it. That hasn't changed over the years. Just kind of gives you a nice clean little finish to bump that brush up against. So as you can see, we got a decent amount of flare out of that. Tried to spin on me a little bit. We'll just kind of push it around with our fingers while we have tension on it. Take another section of yellow. Might have gone too thin on that clump. We'll just cut another. So we'll measure the same way. And trim our butts just a touch on that one. All right, so we've got our two bucktail sections reverse tied in. Now, I just like to work my fingers around them, and then I'll kind of pinch it and just kind of massage everything back, get all those fibers tamed down. And now I'll just wrap over it and kind of make a little bit of a bullet head and put some tension into it just to reflare my bucktail. So now we'll take in our last section of ice wing fiber. Which sometimes it comes out of the bag kind of all tangled up, so you gotta treat it kind of like dubbing, just tease it out, restack it. Fold it back around our thread and pin it to the top one more time. So when I tie that in, I tie it in right in front of that little bullet that I made. That way I can really flare it and kind of look at it before I go to set it exactly where I want it. Alright, everything looks good to me. So now I'm just going to kind of pull all that back, and I'm going to jump back up onto that bullet and just tie it into place. and then I can jump back down to where I was. So now we'll take our EP Minnow head brush, tie it in. This is the grassy olive. There's a ton of different colors in these things, so you can tie this kind of however you want. Like I said, we're looking to get about 4 wraps of this brush in here just to give us enough density to push some water and give us that kind of real good turn action on the pauses. I don't like to go too thick with these because this material does absorb a little bit of water. And you can do this with bucktail, like you can spin some bucktail around the hook and tie like a Buford style as well. It's going to be a little more buoyant. This is kind of a little more neutrally buoyant, suspends pretty well on pauses. But the other thing I like about this material is it has some flash built in with it. Obviously this is a fairly flashy fly, so going to just kind of straight bucktail just didn't quite look right to me. So we've got that tied in with 4 wraps. Trim it out with some junk scissors. Just kind of mash that wire down so it doesn't try to cut our thread as we clean up this head. You can put eyes on it if you want on the brush heads. I don't. I just fish them like this. The other ones I do put eyes on. I don't really think it makes much of a difference as far as how they fish, except for a slight difference in action and depth. So we'll give it a good solid whip finish here at the front. I always do 2 on my streamers just because we are dealing with some fairly toothy brown trout here. Whip that out, give everything one last quick comb. Especially up here on that brush. I'll take it forward and back. I like to beat my flies up in the vise, that way they stay together out there on the water. Alright, and there you have it, the Disco Deceiver. Fairly flashy when it's all said and done, but like I said, once it gets down about 1.5 feet and deeper, there's less light penetration. So it's going to look more like fish scales. Hope you guys enjoy. You can fish it for kind of whatever you want. Go out and tie some, catch some fish on it. Thanks. La, 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 la.